this out. So I took the 3001 ST drivers apart and just left only the mid woofer in there. So you probably recognize the tone as being basically the tone of the human voice is where it trails off, because it was actually designed to be as low in total harmonic distortion up from about 250 hertz up to where it needed to cross over, which is 2.2 kilohertz. So this thing would sound great as like a Bose speaker or something like that, where it just plays only the human voice as a PA or something. But you can hear that it's definitely lacking otherwise. So everything else sounds kind of faded, right? But everything that's kind of within the human vocal range, like the typical vocal range of speech, not really singing, because of course when you're singing you go way above 300 to 2000 to 6000 kilohertz. So 2000 6000 hertz. So basically anyone can sing this. This isn't like challenging anyone's vocals. But listen most carefully to like the detail of what the tweeter would be doing if the tweeter was there. So I'm gonna start stripping it out now. There's actually a little side vents inside the center, so I'll check it out first. So sorry, it's sound a little crispy. So we'll go on to let it go to the next song. It does a lot of really weird stuff like that because it's playing, just the mids. The tweeter is supposed to be playing, what goes in. So basically this driver right here, since no one else has taken it apart and I wanted to really investigate how this thing works, this is actually what the driver typically really looks like. So yeah, I inverted the surround because I couldn't get the exact size surround for it. So I went ahead and just inverted it and basically got it to work. It helped me squeeze it in better. And yeah, that's the tweeter. It's a 3/4 inch. The voice coil actually sits right there on these lines right there. But see these striations right there? Those are actually fins. The fins back there are pretty much a precursor to MediaTek, in the sense where they are actually little horns. So as air is being pistoned forward and backward, the Bernoulli principle is causing air to basically jet stream, the same way that you could use your sails to sail upstream by forcing air between, when you blow between two pieces of paper, it forces the sails to suck together. Same thing happens here. So as this thing pistons forward and backward, the little ridges, the fins back there, are forced together. But since they're all in parallel, but kind of not in exact parallel, they form horns. They're wrestling for equilibrium, and in doing so, they're resonating. So it's almost as if they're being strummed. And in doing that, it accomplishes two things. it allows for the rear to actually play as if it has an air cushion. So it prevents the rear of the cone from having any rear wall distortions, even beyond the back being rounded. But also, the tweeter, being as the voice coil is this large and the tweeter is only in the middle, there's actually a whole gap in there. I'll switch back to the other one. This gigantic gap here is actually the same exact size as this thing. Like literally down to like the millimeter or nanometer even, because it was clearly AutoCADed out of the same part. And I could show you that part that was actually used. If I could find it. Yeah. So this is part of the composite driver. And part of the composite driver, this thing required, in order for it to work optimally, to be a sealed vessel. So when it would be played at high volumes, because this thing is a 100 watt speaker. This thing's a 100 watt speaker. And so this thing is about 1/3 its size. About less than 1/3 its volume. Because this thing's actually made out of solid metal, right? Whereas this thing's made out of MDF, so the wood is about this thick. The metal in this thing is as thin as you could see. And it's all made out of metal and basically aeronautic parts. The front is a soft silicone rubber baffle. They started using the same soft silicone rubber baffle actually as this thing right here, which is no longer Butel Surround, but a soft silicone rubber baffle as well. There's some really interesting properties about this, but it actually does kind of the same thing. And I'll probably link another video where I show how that works, where you could literally just cover the front and you could hear the sound of the tweeter actually resonating off of these little ridges. So if you were to cover the tweeter from the front, it actually doesn't even affect the sound. You still hear the sound of the highs sprawling because of the Tangerine waveguide, sprawling outward and always hitting you depending on which way you are, being struck by the parabola. And at, the last resort, basically, it's gonna hit you with this flat rim right here. When you're sitting at an angle, then you're gonna be hearing the sound coming from the reflection of the tweeter and the woofer merged and coming this way. So which is why people recommend that you toe your cap straight. It's because you never really want to sit in the hot spot. But it doesn't really matter anymore because the way they treated the hot spot makes it so that it's pretty much a moot point now. Because you no longer actually hear the tweeter directly anyway. It's always merged with the woofer or the outer flattened rim. And the outer flattened rim actually has a history. And I'll go and give you a preview of that history real quick. This is actually the I think it might be an IQ7, IQ9 driver. So I put, around the corner from where I live used to be an audio place that closed down during COVID, sadly. I don't know when they're going to back up, but you can see how there's this flare here, and then there's a flat rim. That's not an optical illusion. Flare, and then flat, right? You can even see the striations where it looks almost like a record vinyl, because this was actually coated in it's basically poly coated in titanium. So that flat rim right there works as a long throw woofer, while the inner parabola works as a horn, as a waveguide for the tweeter. Tweeter's missing there because I made these things. These are actually XQ IQ hybrids, which is why they don't really look like any of them. But I didn't like the body of the XQ. I don't really like the sound of the XQ, so I prefer the IQ box a lot more, and I prefer the sound of the drivers and the high resolution of the better next gen like Gen 6.5, I guess, of these UniQ drivers versus the way the older ones required a little bubble on top, a hypertweeter, to play up to 55 kilohertz. So these right here, they finally got their drivers to play as a full single point. If you look at the 2007s, which was their Gen 6 flagship, they were originally they started off with a little hypertweeter on top. And see this solid hunk of copper on top? That was because there used to be the UniQ used to sit on top, pretty much in the same kind of profile as the 2001s, except for rounded, and the back of them was the same shape basically as this, which is pretty much the same shape as, it's basically an extension of phi. It's if you look at like a pentagon, like the star, the triangle that comes off of pentagon, that would be called pentagram, right? That is basically phi. And it's also called the Golden ratio. And you also hear it, and this is pretty much how they make it so that it's really hard to make their speakers better or to upgrade them, is because they actually use tricks to make sure that the drivers wouldn't actually fit properly or wouldn't sound right if you were just to freely swap them without knowing what you're doing. So you actually have to have full access to what drivers have, which is a vast array used across their whole entire series. So this is a mixture of XQ from the XQ10s all the way up to the they're the larger ones. So the XQ 30s up to the XQ 90s. Yeah, so the most important part about it was actually getting it so that these wouldn't be the same tone. And you might actually recognize those tones. I wish I had a straw on me. It makes it easier to tell. But basically the tone between the two, it's kind of like when you pitch drums. The tone may sound like white noise, but they're actually tuned so that they're about 1 to a 5 relationship, principally, with subharmonics at around about 6 and 8. So no matter what, when this thing's all playing, it'll never ever like, let's say if this thing was all like they all had the same resonant frequency as this, there'd be an issue whenever it played any sound that had a rising resonant frequency, where this thing right here, this thing right here, and this thing right here would each all suffer the same issue at the same time. So instead, they sprawled that by making sure that dun 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 dun. So it's basically dun 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 dun. So it's basically 2 notes. It's pretty much the way a guitar is tuned. It's Nirvana's dun 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 dun, the BE, the 2 skinny strings. But the harmonics also allow it to be a 1 and a 5th. Because obviously, it's kind of like steel drum. It has, because of the parabola. So depending on where you hit it, it's gonna have a slight variation in resonance. So it doesn't have like a, ideally it would have no resonance at all, right? I mean, that's the point. So you could get both a Twinkle Twinkle Little Star out of it. Twinkle Twinkle. Twinkle Go little star. Is that how the song goes? And you get the dung dung. And this right here was the old one. And it's not actually the sound of the what's it called? The box. It's actually, these are sealed. And it's sealed again in the proportion of pretty much B. It's calculated, of course, with the volume on top. But Celestion were actually doing the same thing at the same time, so they're just working together. And Celestion mostly work on professional gear, so Kev kind of have a backstage access into what Celestion do for pro musicians who are playing live. And in doing so, when they make their instruments, they make them as if, oh hey buddy, they make their instruments as if they're basically yeah, I guess I said it right. They make their speakers as if they're instruments. So this thing is basically tuned like a guitar. The same way that in a guitar, from the, if you went from the, let's say like the part that's close to you, top to the bottom, it'd be E, A, D, G, B, E. So the last two strings are B, E, and those are actually meant to sound harmonically, what's the term? Pleasant. Yeah, harmonically pleasant in any circumstance. Because anytime that you have a sound and then you have that a nice harmonic over it, that's like the whole history of Gregorian chanting, right? It's just pretty much like harmonies. And that's why the whole pseudo myth of the devil's note, diabolos, is that really, really hard note that you hit that is meant to, it's used in a lot of like, by a lot of like metal. It made it's like a whole mythology in metal as being like the devil's note or something like that, as it was banned in music because it like summoned the devil. But what it really did was, it was a really, really hard note to hit. And in a room as acoustic as a cathedral, which is what it was designed for, if you were to hit that note wrong, it would destroy it would cause cacophony. It would diabolos. It would throw asunder, throw everything apart. So it would actually just kind of wreck the chanting, which was supposed to sound like just ambient, hypnotic sound. So this thing right here has some cool features that actually all trace its way forward and backward to the 2007s. And that is that this proportion is the same as to this proportion, which is the same as to this proportion. And because of that, even though these two are playing in like electronic parallel, this plays a little bit lower, around 8 hertz lower. It plays at a lower latency because it has a larger volume cabinet. They started using the elliptical ports, so it has like a broader bandwidth, like basically rear reflection that is able to merge with the front wave to give you the more spacious sound. And the box itself is supposed to behave as if it's a perfect vessel for, it's almost as if, well, it's just true that pretty much like whatever applies to the way that the inside of a box would be designed ideally is the way your room should sound. And that's why the Sydney Opera House looks so wacky. That's why churches look so wacky. It's because they actually avoid things like right angles. They make everything all rounded, and they try to make everything more textured and everything everywhere, because they are trying to balance basically the resonance, get rid of any echoes, get rid of any standing waves, and kind of diffuse the sound and make it sound good. It's kind of like when you're singing in the shower, right? So the proportions there prevent it so that even if these two were just pointed directly at straight at a brick wall, even though they would be playing the same note technically, like because they're electronically in parallel, they wouldn't be, because this would actually play a little bit in, it would be because of the larger volume. Mechanically, it operates almost like it's a four-way. So this plays about 8 hertz lower, and it plays about 300 to 600 milliseconds behind this one, which is a very good choice because it makes it sound like it's a live sound. Because when you're sitting in a club or an arena or just any live performance, you hear sound that's coming directly at you, and you hear sound that's bouncing off of all the walls around you, and those come to you as, obviously stereo in the sense where it's left versus right, whichever ear hits you first. Also stereo in the other form, in the z-axis, as in timing. Which angle did the sound enter your ear versus what this room sounds like? Because the whole entire room is resonating with a certain sound, and like the way that the sound enters your ear is in context to the sound of the room as a whole. And the reason why we think that stereo is not 3D in like a complete sense, but we do believe that stereo is at least like a front bubble. Like we understand that stereo creates a phantom center image, and the better your speakers are calibrated, the more hi-fi they are, etc., the more convincing the center image is, to the point where the singer, like Stevie Nicks would sound like she's behind like the speakers about 6 feet, about 3 feet, and like the drummer would sound behind her about 6 feet, and then the guitarist would actually sound like over here, like actually wider than the actual speakers, like somewhere. So the soundscape of stereo can be wider than the actual speakers themselves, and it could be narrower than the speakers themselves in producing a phantom center where the singer in the center sounds distinctly like she is actually really right in the middle, and there's space around her, and she could walk back and forth, and she could do everything as if there's really a speaker in the middle. And that's what stereo is. And the reason why we don't have that behind us so much is actually because of the acoustic bias of the room. We have the front speaker playing the sound of direct audio from the stereo on phase, and we have the sound of out of phase coming from the front speakers. So everything's front loaded, everything's front heavy and biased to the front of the room. So it sounds as if everything is, it makes it seem as if stereo is pretty much just panning left and right. But we know stereo isn't panning left and right, because if that were the case, then how would the Vanishing Act work? How would sound as if they're coming wider than your actual speakers are set up? How would the phantom center work? How would you be able to hear above you? How would you be able to hear, like, just, like things that sound so realistic that, like, I was watching Stranger Things the other day, and they're running through that hospital, and they had that scene where they're playing they had the overhead speaker, what used to be called a tannoy. It was to the top right behind my shoulder, and it actually sounded like there was a speaker embedded in my ceiling, and there was a voice coming out of the speaker, and I only had this room right here is actually set up for Atmos. It's like, but it's not actually used for Atmos for the most part, because actually when it's just me and just like, a small group of us, we tend to not care, and I don't want to set it all up. And I could set it up for 2 rows of seating, but when you have everyone sitting in just one chair, listening in stereo actually sounds more seamless. And you actually end up with more of a three-dimensional sound that sounds more seamless that way. But anyway, to produce these speakers, you can still see the little gap on top right there. I couldn't get the driver to fit perfectly. But what's cool is that it did teach me what metal this is made out of. It's made out of at least a copper composite because it's actually a green patina. And when you hold it, it's always cold to the touch. It's always solid. But that was actually a relic from the 2007s, and the 2007.2s borrowed from the XQs, which got the dual diaphragm perfected along with the Tangerine waveguide, and got the tweeter to be able to play up to hypertweeter frequencies, which is like 55 kilohertz, plus or minus 3 dB. And so they're able to get true single point sound out of just one speaker instead of having it supplemented with the bubble on top with the hypertweeter. And so the 2007s also benefited and came out with the 2007.2s, where they rested their Uniq on top. They had a mid in the center with the phase port, and then they went on to make the Muon, where the phase plug thing is still there, and everything else looks exactly the same, except for they just pretty much took the woofers and also put them on top. So with the Uniq there and the phase plug there as the mid, it kind of looks like a penis, especially because it made it wide and like an hourglass shape. So it's like, I actually honestly think it's hideous. But yeah, I guess that's why they made the blade, because the blade definitely looks a lot better. But what's cool about these is because they made them V shaped. These play as mids, and these play as low frequency woofers. And they kind of play in a gradient, so that while these play more bippity, these play more boopity. And these play more like, they're the mids that would be the waveguide to the tweeter. They got the Tangerine waveguide working, so the Tangerine waveguide allows for the tweeter to sprawl its sound evenly as if it's a flat panel. Because the Tangerine waveguide, as Kef just loves to do, they take what's outside and put it in the inside. So instead of relying on the horn, the woofer, to be both the horn and the woofer in the waveguide, they now have the tweeter as its own full array, where it is a horn-loaded compression tweeter with an acoustic waveguide, where these little fins that look almost like they're 2D from the front are actually pretty thick from the back, and they cover about 1/3 of the surface area. It doesn't look like it, but if you were to take it off and look at it, it is. And it's also very interesting to note that they're tuned. They took a lot of very careful detail, and the way that the Tangerine waveguides are made are actually acoustically sound, and they are actually mated to their respective tweeters. So everything is what they call total system design, where everything has to actually fit exactly like it's Big Ben. I guess that's Britain for you. So like their speakers are supposed to work like where everything works together as one, and this thing actually had one variation of that, and it was based off of what Celestion was also doing at the time, which was doing the whole bowed back, one solid piece of wood in the back, one solid piece of wood in front, right? So that makes it so that there's no right angles. Any sound that comes from the rear of the woofer wouldn't be able to cause any rear wave refractions or any kind of ring distortion, and you'd get clean sound from the woofer. And they were confident enough that they coated it in titanium for the first time, whereas before it was like this black poly. What's interesting is that you see this ridge right here and this flat portion. I keep bringing that up, right? Why do I keep bringing that up? It's because, watch this. It's like magic. See how there's this rim right here? And this is just a regular butyl surround. Well, in between that, KEF does the thing where every so often, if you take notice, they use the center speaker as a reference speaker, which is what is used to then tune their mains according to. And it also allows them to create a mono speaker that they could test individually to see and basically to improve. But I guess to kind of show the sound. This is why I couldn't use this for this. Dun 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 dun. This is actually the same tone as this. Hear it? Dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun. And they're not the only ones who do this. If you actually find like a three-way speaker, you'll notice that if you tap the tweeter, if you can tap the tweeter, sometimes they have the larger tweeter you can, that the tweeter, the woofer, and the mid will actually have 3 different tuning frequencies because pretty much it's just good speaker design. But this is actually the center. And this is the first time they actually made a custom surround. These right here are the regular Butel surrounds. Notice how they're just like regular Butel. I just buy these off the shelf. They were just rounded. Now look at these ones. Notice how there's also something missing, and how it coincides with how they change the surround. The surround is not a surround that you could buy. You actually have to replace the entire driver if you need to, because the surround is actually a continuity of the woofer. This surround is flattened right here. See it? It's perfectly smooth when you go from here to there. Whereas if you go back to, I guess, I'm gonna put this up here. This guy. This is not perfectly smooth. You could definitely feel like a big bump right here, right? This is actually meant because this driver is meant to be in front of you and clear of side walls, and that's anticipated. It's a center speaker, so why not experiment on having a speaker be a perfect mono speaker in that regard. So they had it so that this does the same thing. Dun 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 dun. So they always do that. So yeah, this is actually left alone. So this is the IQ something. I forget. It's the center version. So I got it separately from the other ones. But these also have the bullet woofers, which is pretty cool. But these don't have the tangerine waveguide, and you can see the difference. They still have that snout though, and the snout there is to prevent there from being any cross contamination between when they do their handoff between the crossover. Both speakers are then playing at their highest level, and that handoff needs to be smooth. So with speakers where the tweeter is a coaxial or coincident or something, there's a very high chance that the tweeter and the woofer would cause what's called intermodular distortion, which is the same thing that happens as when you're tuning your guitar and you have one of your guitar strings just a little bit off and you're kind of just getting it on, and it does that war 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 sound, and as you're getting into tune it goes war 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 and it smoothens out. Well, as these two do the handover, it causes the same issue. So by having that ridge around it, it blocks, it's creating pretty much like a shadow, an acoustic shadow, so that the ridge, the outer ridge of the tweeter, which is the least reliable part, doesn't cause any issues, and it doesn't reflect along the woofer and use it as a waveguide. So it basically has a mechanical crossover cutoff, like a brick wall cutoff there, and it allows for the woofer to take over at the crossover point. But yeah, the flat portion here is now supplemented by the surround, and the fact that the flat portion is supplemented by the surround was something that worked out pretty well. And you could tell that they believed that because, let's go back to the other guys. So this right here is where the parabola ends. This is where the tweeter is able to use the woofer as a waveguide. From here on outward, it's almost like a throwaway zone. And this right here would be just extra space for the woofer to work as like a long throw woofer, and it gives it more, space to move air, but also allows for the last remnants of the tweeter as it sprawls to converge with the woofer, so you end up getting as much as possible of the single point sound. And ideally, you'd be hearing it from an angle anyway. So ideally, you'd be hearing the reflection of the tweeter off of the woofer, off of whatever whichever angle the parabola happens to be facing you. But from the front, you'd be hearing it sprawl, and ideally, you wouldn't be hearing the tweeter at all. And you can actually you could test this yourself. If you stand really, really close, yeah, you can hear the tweeter. But if you stand farther back, you'll hear the tweeter sound almost like it's coming from here, like it's coming from this rim, or it's coming from the outer rim, as if it's just one driver. But look at the parabola here. This is the elasticities. Notice the difference? So what happened was that they got rid of the flat portion completely, and the tweeter is now larger, and the horn is now larger. So essentially, they took that pit in between where the woofer was a parabola and worked as a horn, and the tweeter, and they enlarged it, and they turned they turned what they call the Z flex around into the flat portion that used to be on the outside of the driver. And it works much better because now the outside is bounded. So with the outside bounded and the tweeter with its horn always, and with the tangent waveguide, making it so that the tweeter no longer just pokes the air and grazes the air along the side, but equalizes the air pressure, like kind of almost like an air acoustic lens. So it ideally sounds like the air is being pushed by a flat panel, like a electrostat or a ribbon tweeter. So when the tweeter goes in and out, it's able to actually pressurize the air evenly across the entire dome, so that there isn't a hot spot in the center, and there isn't the grazing of the air on the side. Instead, you have even air dispersion across the entire whole of the round tweeter. Even though the tweeter is pistoning in and out, it behaves more like the tweeter is like expanding and contracting, which is ideally what a tweeter should do. So this ridge right here isn't really meant to be some kind of flourish. It is meant to look cool. In fact, my wife hates the way those look, and I think a lot of people don't like the way those look, because there's actually a type of fear that people have, like fear of spider eggs, that it gets to people. But these right here work as bridge, as like the fins that allow for the tweeter to actually have this last minute resort where no matter how much the woofer woofs, how much now this thing could freely woof as a actual true low frequency woofer, right? So this thing will blast and move a lot more, and it's ready for it. This thing's tuned down to 54. The port is tuned down to 52 hertz, I'm pretty sure. And so is this one. These are actually both tuned down to 52 hertz at the port and crossed over at 2.2 kilohertz. So as this thing pistons in and out, no matter what, the outer rim stays fixed, which means that these little ridges also stay fixed, which means this little horn right here can always rely on the outer ridges to converge the sound of the woofer and the tweeter, even if you're sitting right in front. And that's how you're able to cover, if you got like half a ping pong ball, you could cover the tweeter and still hear the whole entire sound of the woofer as if you didn't do anything. You'll still hear the tweeter. The sound of the tweeter when you're sitting in front doesn't actually radiate directly to you anymore. There isn't really a hot spot anymore, because the main issue with these types of drivers was what's called the shotgun effect, which is where, since that's the area's lowest sensitivity, sitting right directly in line would cause there to be a hot spot in the center. So they actually completely cooled off and eliminated that hot spot in the center. And so that when you're in the center, the air automatically sprawls and works almost like it's outside in, so that whatever air is available to the tweeter is limited by this tangent waveguide. And then as it is kicked back out, is then limited by however much is caught by the waveguide up until this point right here. And this right here is tuned. And you'll notice that it's actually the same octave, or not octave, sorry. It's the same proportion. Dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun. This material here, the silicone rubber baffle, is the same material as what's used here. That's why it has the same sound. Dun dun. Dun 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 dun. Yeah. So back to the other one. So I'm gonna make a part 2 off of this one, because the video is getting quite long. I didn't mean to do that little interlude there. I didn't mean for it to get that long, at least. So thanks for hanging on. So yeah, I'm gonna finish unpacking this thing and have you hear the difference between just the front of the woofer and what the woofer sounds like from the rear. So I already started removing the center and allowing for the venting holes to allow some of the horns to actually play through the center, as if there's like a little phantom tweeter in there. But yeah, thanks.